We have this incredibly bloated financial sector. It's a phony crisis. They don't have to be cuts. We know how to get out of a Great Depression. You spend money. If we take a look at the typical worker, they're not doing fine.
Hi, I'm Dean Baker, your host for Mostly Economics. Today we have with us Juliet Schor, who's an economist and professor of sociology at Boston College, and is the author of a new book, The 4-Day Workweek, the life-changing solution to reducing employee stress, improving well-being, and working smarter. Thanks for joining us, Julie.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Dean.
So I want to go back. This is now ancient history, I guess. You wrote a book that is hugely important to me. I think it was a big seller, actually, The Overworked American, which, if my memory serves me right, was 1992, which puts us as ancient history. But anyhow, the basic story was that we've in the United States, we work a lot more than everyone else, or at least a lot more than people in other rich countries. If you compare us, Germany, France, UK. Pretty much everyone else. And that was the basic story there. And, again, clearly true. And it was one of the things, the book came out and, I remember it did get a lot of play. And I was thinking, well, that's great. We're going to start to see shorter work weeks. I don't know how things turn out.
Well, that's not exactly what happened. It is true that it got a lot of attention across the political spectrum. People were really resonant with the message. And I think that was because people understood how stressed out, overworked Americans were at that time and have been. But in some sense, it ran up against other economic trends that, of course, you have written about and know very well, which is that it was sort of coming in a period when inequality was rising, extreme inequality was rising. One of the things we learned after I wrote that book, a number of new papers came out showing that countries that have more inequality tend to have longer hours of work. And we also entered into a very conservative neoliberal period in which that kind of economic thinking was becoming more and more dominant, and kind of austerity thinking took hold. And one of the things that I found really interesting was that by the end of the 90s, many people, who I would have considered allies on the sort of left progressive economic wing of things, were not really interested or maybe even hostile to shorter working hours. So it really kind of fell off the table until the pandemic, and then things started to change. And as it fell off the table, what happened was that upward creep of hours that I had identified as beginning, sort of slowly and then more rapidly in the 80s, continued through the 90s into the first and second decades of the 2000s. So working hours did slowly, not, rapidly, but slowly continue to creep up over that period.
I remember a real long time ago, I guess I was still in college when I first read Keynes, and you make reference to this, I know frequently, that, Keynes talked about, I'm forgetting, he had a 4-day work week, he envisioned, we're seeing rising productivity growth. Keynes, of course, writing in the 30s, we were seeing rising productivity growth, but it wasn't new even then. And, the logic of rising productivity growth, on the one hand, you could get more things, that's great and all that, but you get more leisure time. And, again, that wasn't a news story even in the 30s. You go back to the 19th century, a big demand for labor unions here and elsewhere was for the 8-hour day. That, 8 hours to work, 8 hours to sleep, 8 hours to do what we want. And, that they pretty much won that. But that was, we go back to the 30s in the United States, the Fair Labor Standards Act that set 40 hours as a normal work week. That was, 70 plus years ago, 70, 90 years ago now. And we haven't seen much improvement on that. So It is, again, to my mind, very unfortunate because, it's great if people can get more stuff, but, people need time, they need leisure, and, more stuff often isn't a good substitute for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, that was the big theme of the book, The Overworked American, which was, why are we not taking our productivity growth in the form of any free time? I mean, we had been, from 1870 until about 1970, we were. And, we led the world in work time reduction. We had the first 5-day week. We had shorter working hours than many other countries. And then that all stalled out and things started to go in the other direction. And um, I really agree with you about this point of more stuff versus more time. And of course, for people who don't have enough, who are not meeting basic living standards and so forth, they need more money, no question about it. But you have a lot of Americans who are getting more income, but income is positional. Consumer goods are positional, and if everybody else is getting them as well, you feel like you're just running harder, faster and faster to keep up. Leisure is not, in our world, a positional good. I mean, it was in the past, but it's not a positional good, and people mostly just enjoy the leisure that they get. So many people get much more well-being out of more free time, and the new research that I've been doing, absolutely supports that view, in a way that maybe once they have a pretty decent standard of living, more stuff, more money doesn't necessarily give them as much well-being.
Yeah, and certainly insofar as we're talking about positional goods, so people aren't familiar with the reference. The idea is just like, oh, my neighbor has this big new car, I have to have one too, or I'm a failure. So people, and again, that's putting it more crudely than it really works in the world. But nonetheless, our consumption patterns, we see what people around us have, we think we should have that too. And insofar as, that's how we're evaluating our living standards, that's an endless race, that someone gets more, their neighbor gets more, and it goes back and forth. And, there's never an end to that. So, we all recognize people need food on the table. They need a decent place to live. There are goods we absolutely need. And again, unfortunately, too many people in the United States don't have those things. But once you have those things, when you want to get more and more, that is a endless and arguably pointless race.
Yeah. So the Overworked American, I mean, there was a lot in there about why employers don't give people the choice of more free time or more money. The incentives that employers were facing, which were really strong at the time, to have fewer people working longer hours. And of course, the way we finance health insurance in this country is one of them, but it's a very big one. Other kinds of taxes, which are capped so that additional hours, they're not paying more of those taxes. Salaried work, which has become such a huge fraction of the labor force is salaried. Those extra hours are, in a sense, free to the employer because they pay us a fixed salary. And if they get people to work more hours, which I found you do on a salary, no surprise, they're free to the employer, and various other reasons, so that this sort of structural, kind of inbuilt structural incentives in our economy for long hours, which are different than many of the countries you referenced at the beginning of our conversation, where people work a lot less. I mean, one of the really, I think, striking things that's happened since I wrote The Overworked American, which was, so I published it about the same time my son was born, so I always know how many years ago it was that it came out, just almost 35 years.
You know how old it is.
The Japanese were the world's workaholics when that book came out. The Japanese now work less on average than Americans, and the city of Tokyo just put all of its employees on a 4-day work week. So, yeah. We're behind here in America.
And you mentioned the structural things is one of these things that came, well, sort of under the radar. I'm sure some people are paying attention, but I don't think many people. Two of the issues that were back burner in the campaign or between or I should say Biden, Harris, and Trump. One was the overtime cutoff. So, and I have to confess, I don't know what the exact numbers are, but of course we have, the 40-hour work week for overtime, but also if you're a salaried worker, if you're below a certain pay level. So basically, the argument, the idea here is that you shouldn't be able to avoid paying overtime by calling someone a salaried worker rather than an hourly worker. And, in many cases, okay, that's fine. The CEO of a company, salary, that's fair enough. But the logic is if you have substantial supervisory responsibilities, then you could be a salary worker. But if you don't, then just calling someone a salary worker doesn't exempt them from overtime. And we hadn't been raising that cutoff. So there was a cutoff. If you're below a certain wage, you're automatically eligible for overtime, just put it that way. And what that meant was if you work 45, 50 hours a week, but you're the assistant manager at a McDonald's, you still get overtime for those 5 hours. You might not even get paid for it otherwise, but you both get paid for the 5 hours and you get overtime for that 5 hours. And the Obama first and Biden administration raised it, and I think Biden had wanted to raise it to 54,000, if I remember correctly. It's probably not the exact number, but something like that. And Trump came right in and rolled that back, and I think we're at something like 40 now. So that's a pretty low cutoff. So that means a lot of workers, again, the assistant manager at a fast food place has pretty minimal responsibilities, but they call them management. They don't pay them overtime. And again, odds are they don't even pay them for those hours at all. So that was one thing, encourage longer hours. The other thing that, again, drove me nuts because you had people saying, oh, this is a good thing to do, that Trump had his proposal to exempt overtime pay from taxation. And I'm going, okay, so you're encouraging the whole logic, I shouldn't say the whole logic, but much of the logic of the Fair Labor Standards Act, for more than 40 hours a week, was that if you work more than that, you got your wage premium, but also it discouraged employers from working you 45, 50 hours a week because they had to pay more. That was the logic. Now we're giving a tax break if they have you work more than 40 hours a week. So I'm just going, this is crazy. And, if you want to do something for people working overtime, raise the premium. Instead of it being 50%, make it 75%. I mean, okay, you can make whatever you want. But the point was we should be looking to discourage employers from working people long hours, not encouraging it. And again, it's the employers in almost all cases who makes the decision, because it's pretty rare that you have a workplace where the employer just says, hey, anyone want to work an extra 5 hours this week? You get time and a half. They say you have to work an extra 5 hours this week and you do get time and a half, but it's not the employee's call.
Yeah, there's a lot that turned out to be dysfunctional about this system. You're raising this reminds me, I was doing phone banking for the big, beautiful, ugly bill. And I think it was in Florida, and somebody I called said, no, I love this bill because I'm going to get tax-free overtime. But here's the thing about the Fair Labor Standards Act setup and the overtime premium that people don't understand. What ended up happening was that base pay in jobs where there's more overtime, base pay falls. So people have to do more overtime. And it became, instead of something which discourages overtime, which I realize it does to some extent, it also kind of instituted long hours as something that workers really wanted. And so once the employers could reduce that base pay, they could get those longer hours. And the average wage across both regular and overtime hours was less than the average wage just, in the standard work week. So personally, I'm a fan of comp time systems. Actually, I think we need to figure out how much free time people should have, or at least how many hours they should work at a main job. And if they have to work overtime, they get time off. But of course, that's not going to happen until wages are higher.
Yeah. No, you're mentioning about standardizing that, yeah, if you just look at, this isn't very careful analysis, just, it's published every month by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average work week in many manufacturing industries is 44, 45, 46 hours. So obviously they've institutionalized overtime. It's not the exception, it's the norm. So
exactly. And if you look at the full-time workers, what is the work week of full-time workers for most of the post-World War II period? It has been above 40 hours. The full-time worker never, it took, I think now it's around that, but it took how many decades to actually get a 40-hour week? Since 1940.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Which in a way brings us to the 5-day week and the 4-day week, because it's kind of amazing to think. I think the last time I calculated, it's 85 years. 85, because it doesn't actually come in 1938. It comes in 1940 because they have a 2-step process to get down to the 40 hour.
That's right. I think it was 42 hours.
85 hours without 85 years without reducing the work week. And we've had a 4-fold increase in productivity. And that's it right there. Let's just think about that, that kind of astounding fact.
Yeah, no, it is amazing. And, obviously we have had improvements in living standards, but very little in the way of increased leisure, and that's, again, obviously an important part of people's lives. All right, well, let's get to, we have the pandemic, and I'm forgetting exact years that your experiment, because your work with 4-day work week, with the exact years that you started that, but it does overlap with the pandemic. And I can't remember, had you started it post-pandemic or pre-pandemic?
Post. So we were approached the trial. So the planning for the 4-day week trials that my book is about began in 2021, and the first trial started at the beginning of 2022. And we continue to survey and research, collect data from companies that are switching from 5 to 4 days. What's really important to be clear about, because I've had people sending me irate emails about this is not a compressed work week. It's not 4 10-hour days, and it's not an 80% salary. That's what people immediately go to those two ideas. So what is it that is being taken away from workers? And in these trials, which hundreds of companies and more than 10,000 workers around the world have been part of, they are getting a 32-hour work week with no reduction in pay. So they're getting effectively a wage increase and a day off work. And those started in, as I said, 2022. And that first year, we started a new trial every 2 months. And we have been doing trials through 23 and 2024, and smaller trials in this last year. And there's another one that's going to be starting in the UK in the fall. Well, we're in the fall now, so I think next month the trainings and the onboarding are beginning, and I can explain more about all of that. But yeah.
And one of the things, and again, I was struck by this. I remember there was a write-up, I think, in the New York Times of this, and it said that productivity had increased, and the way they had written it up was that firms were getting more output, total output in 4-day week than they had previously in the 5-day week. And I looked at that and go, wait a second, they're getting more. And I was saying, well, that must be they must have misrepresented that, because I could believe they're getting more per hour, but can they actually be getting more total? And so I wrote that up on my blog, and you sent me a note saying, no, they're actually getting more total. And I was really struck by that. So I don't know, you want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. So let me just say a little bit about the findings, and then we'll dive into the productivity stuff, which is pretty fascinating. So my team at Boston College has been doing surveying and collecting data from the companies, a little bit of administrative data. And we're also doing interviews with people, and we have teams around the world doing interviews and so forth. So we've got this enormous amount of data. Our survey covers a lot of things. We have 20 metrics of well-being. And this is the part that I think is obvious, or, people would expect. Tremendous increases in well-being among the workers. So you've got 70% of people scoring lower on a burnout scale. All of these are significant, whether we're talking about lower levels of anxiety and fatigue, sleeping more and better, exercising more, less work-family conflict, less work-life conflict, more positive emotions, fewer negative emotions. Okay, stress, you name it. Fine. The second set of things is around their work experiences. So some of the things we were worried about, are they all just taking second jobs? No, it looks like second job holding even decreases a little bit. That was a surprise. People's workplace sociability doesn't fall. But the really big thing that happens in terms of their experience of work is that people's self-reports of productivity go up a lot. They just really jump. And in the comments on our survey and the interviews we do, people explain how much more on top of their work they feel, how much less anxiety they feel about going back to work on Monday, how there's a 2-month preparation period in which companies do different things, but they figure out, well, how can we get as much work done in 4 days as 5? And I should say that most of our companies are white collar companies, not all of them. We have construction, we have manufacturing, we have restaurants, healthcare, etc. But it's mostly white collar. And those are many of those workplaces had enough slack and kind of enough wasted time. A lot of it is meetings and interruptions and so forth, that by tightening up, and everybody kind of tightening up what they're doing, they were able to get as much done. So the self-reports are really positive in terms of people feeling more on top of their work and more productive. And we do have just a self-report productivity. And then we have a work smart scale, which also goes up, sort of asking particular things about being efficient and finding better ways to do things and so forth. So these are mostly small and medium-sized enterprises. The biggest one in that trial was a 5,000-person firm that has put 1,000 people on the trial to begin with. They then rolled out the new schedule to everybody. We have some really big ones, but that just did certain divisions within. So these are not gigantic firms, but over time, we got more and more in the kind of 250 to 500 range. So they're not teensy either. We have a lot of really small ones, though. But many of these firms don't have great data on productivity. They wouldn't even really know how to measure productivity in the way that economists measure it, because they're knowledge workers. Or I have a discussion in the book about Kickstarter, which was one of the more visible, the so-called lead firm in the first US trial. And the head of the operations there is sort of like, what is the productivity of a programmer? Is it lines of code? Is it how many times the website crashes? It's really hard to know that. So we did ask the companies to sort of rate what happened to productivity. We have revenue data, which is the one thing that they all had. The more data-driven companies have their own KPIs, key performance indicators, or OKRs, organizational somethings. So they have, but there are many of them, right? So, they might have 30 KPIs that they follow. So we don't have a productivity metric from the companies. But what we do have is many of them telling us either productivity didn't fall or it went up. And, those are soft results. But I would say there's a way in which another statistic that we've been keeping is actually the most important one. And that's how many stay on this schedule for at least a year. So we we asked them at 6 months, and then we ask again at a year. And when we went back to ask this, many of them were past a year. I mean, we have companies now have been doing it since the beginning of 2022. But 90% of them stay on the schedule. So it seems pretty likely that their sense of productivity, even if they don't, the ones who don't have the hard numbers, is probably pretty close to being accurate.
Yeah, that says a lot. And just for any non-nerds who we might have here, the idea of productivity, we're trying to measure output per hour of work. And, if we're talking about classical manufacturing, we can do that reasonably well. How much cloth did you sew in an hour? There's a physical product there. You can measure it and go, okay, how much did you do in an hour? Even that could end up being complicated. I won't go into that. But when you get into something more abstract, you have software programmers. What is it that they're doing? Do you want more programs? I mean, that wouldn't be very meaningful. You want better programs. You want programs that don't crash, So these are all somewhat vaguer metrics. But, at the end of the day, as Julie was saying, the companies have an idea of what they're producing. And if they're producing stuff that their customers want, and they're able to produce, as much or more of that with the 4-day work week, they know it. So that's at the end of the day, pretty much the measure of productivity that we care about. And in principle, if we can measure it, that's what we want to measure. So, we aren't interested in the number of programs they design. We want how many good programs did they design? And if it's one really good program, that's better than 1,000 not very good programs that no one's going to really want. So it is a little more ill-defined when we talk about these sorts of services. But nonetheless, the companies do know what their customers want. And, again, you're saying it speaks for itself. 90% continue to do it. So they're, voting with their feet in that sense.
Yeah. And there's another piece to this, which is really important. It may or may not be interesting, but I think it is, which is the typical economist's, response when you talk about this is all about productivity. And, they're very skeptical that you could go from 5 to 4 without a loss in productivity, that there's that much, there's that much slack, or there's that much inefficiency in the way people are doing things and so forth. But what the firm even though the economists they're like productivity is top of mind, that's not the only thing that matters for the company. What matters for the company is the full calculation of costs and benefits around this change. And one of the things that we see that's really striking and turned out to be very important in the pandemic and continues to be important, although maybe a little bit less, in a recessionary economy, if we're heading into that, is that people do not quit at 4-day week firms. And what I found was there's a group of companies that are not really worried about maintaining all that productivity. And there are some who don't even think about it. They've got to solve another problem, which is that their people are burning out because their work intensity is so high. And this is what I saw in some of the healthcare firms, the nursing studies. We see it in some of the nonprofits. There's a restaurant that I profile in the book that they actually had their chefs and general managers who worked 55 hours a week, so long hours. They just gave them a day off. They're not trying to make them work any harder or more in the 4 days that they're there. They figured out how to manage without them, and it's they did a few things that it wasn't costly. It worked really well. And they got fantastic results. They got people stop quitting, and then they get much better applicants for jobs when they advertise jobs because they were an expanding company. And this was a time when there were so many unfilled positions in the U.S. economy. And, we were also doing this through the Great Resignation. But the other thing that happens, and we see this in the nurses' studies where they have really good data on patient outcomes, is that quality goes up. When your people are, and you were just talking about quality, Dean, when your people are more rested, when they are more, positive about work, one of the things that the general manager of one of the restaurants told me is like, people are way more willing to pitch in and go to special events and do other things. And the service is so much better. And they just have had really fantastic results. So I've got a couple of companies telling me about how they're able to sell more business to existing clients once they went on this schedule, because their people were more creative about it. They weren't constantly having turnover on the teams. These are in kind of marketing and advertising and PR. We had a lot of firms in that field. So they're selling more to their existing clients, and they don't have to spend so much time going out trying to drum up new clients, which may not yield a lot of revenue. So they dealing with that very costly problem of turnover. And some of these industries have really high turnover in restaurants, healthcare, advertising. One of the people I profile in the book said, 30% is a typical advertising turnover rate. So they're spending inordinate amounts of time hiring, onboarding, training, integrating new people. And if that goes away, it's about a 30% cost for the loss of a team member. So in that field, I mean, it's different at McDonald's, obviously.
Yeah. No, the turnover point's an incredibly important one. I think really underappreciated. I know when, if you go back, well, it's not ancient history. When Biden was in the White House, we had very low unemployment through most of the period. I mean, we were down at 3.4, 3.3. I think we got down to 3.3%, which, historically we haven't been that low since the 50s. So that was a pretty good story, at least in my view. But there was this line, well, everyone sees inflation, but 3.3%, that's what in the current labor market, current given the size of the workforce, 6 million people. So most people aren't seeing unemployment, but and again, I heard economists say this, and go, wait a second, that's not the labor market, because any given month, even when the economy's strong, somewhere around 5 million people are losing or leaving their job. So, I mean, you take that over a year, that's 60 million people. Now, some of those are 2 or 3 times, so it's not literally 60 million people lose or leave their job, but people are going back and forth between jobs, and that is something that's very, very common. It's a very large share of the workforce, and from the employer standpoint, yeah, if you have a worker you consider a good worker, and they're burned out or they don't like the job because it works too many hours, whatever it might be, that's a real cost to you. You have to replace them, and maybe less so for McDonald's, but it's a problem even there. But when you're talking about more skilled workers, that's a really big deal, and obviously that's primarily who you're working with the 4-day work weeks. These work people with real skills, and if they're jumping job to job to job, that's a loss to employers. So obviously they care about that. And again, your other point. I'm sure we've all encountered medical residents that, I think it's a little better now, but they almost take pride in how many hours a week they work, because, it's sometimes over 100. There's some restriction of that, how long they're able to work residents, because sometimes, it was 110, 120 hours a week. Safe bet that someone who's been on the job for over 100 hours that week is not, as alert as you would want them to be when they're dealing with a patient who has serious medical issues. So, I mean, that's an extreme case, but it shouldn't be hard to believe that if someone approaches their work with a fresh mind, fresh eyes, that they're able to do better work. And, that seems to be what you discovered with these experiments with 4-day work weeks.
Yeah, so many people describe it as life-changing, transformative, and they just feel so much more on top of their work. It's really interesting how one of the things we hear from people on the 5-day week are things like the Sunday scaries. They're really dreading going back to work. Or that why do we call Wednesday hump day? Well, because people are having a hard time getting through 5 days. And there's a group of companies that take the Wednesdays off. Apparently it's a huge golf day now, Wednesdays. So absolutely, it's just part of it. And I talk about this at the beginning of the book. So, why is it that switching from 5 to 4 is is so has such a big impact. And part of the answer is that unlike the 50s, oh yeah, I've had these, guys write to me. There was an excerpt of the book that came out in the Wall Street Journal, and I got a lot of hostile commentary. And, people writing, I worked 60 hours a week, or I worked 70 hours a week, and what's wrong with these lazy people, and why can't they do that? And I'm like, well, and by the way, tell me about your wife who was at home full-time taking care of your kids and so forth. So now we're in a world where we have very few of those families where there's a full-time person working at home doing all that work. And the title of one of the chapters in the book is 2 days is not enough. This is what people were saying, because a 2-day weekend doesn't work in a world where you have either dual earner, 2 full-time earners, or single parent families, because there's too much to be done, too much to get done on the weekend, and there is no time for recuperation and recovery. And that's what the 4-day week gives people, is it gives them that time to recover and get ready for the week ahead. And that's part of why so many people talk to us about feeling energized and glad to get back to work, eager to get back to work. And it's why I think that there's one more dimension of why employers like long hours that I wrote about in The Overworked American. And it has to do with what economists call either the cost of job loss or the employment rent, meaning the value to the worker of the job relative to their next best option. So for the vast majority of workers, the next best option is a 5-day week, because there are not many 4-day weeks that pay full salary. Well, in The Overworked American, what I argued was when people work longer hours, that increases their cost of job loss, because their incomes go up with those longer hours. And if they can't get another long hour job, it's better. So what the 4-day week does is it dramatically raises the value of the job to the worker, because the other alternatives are much less. And we measured this. We asked people, thinking about your next job, if it were a 5-day job. First, we said, which do you prefer, a 4 or a 5? Okay, there's a couple percent who prefer a 5-day. So we took all the ones who prefer the 4, 96% or whatever it was. Thinking about your next job, if it were a 5-day-a-week job, how much more salary would you want to take that job? And we have 13% of the people in the sample who say no amount of money could ever induce me to go back to a 5-day. But, most of them are in that 26 to 50% more salary. So a lot more salary to go back to 5. And that's the value of a 4-day week job. And that's why people don't quit it, because suddenly it just balloons in value to people. Those jobs are, they're a little bit like hen's teeth, right? They're scarce and valuable.
Yeah. No, that really does say a lot. I mean, if people are unwilling to leave, then, they're happy with it. And it's not often you get a story where, both the workers are happy with it and the employers are. And,
Yes.
that seems to be the case here. And that's really quite an impressive story.
Yeah.
So we're going to get mass adoption of 4-day work weeks.
What's that?
I'm being a little sarcastic here. I'm saying, are we going to get mass adoption of 4-day work weeks? I'm obviously being somewhat sarcastic, but do you see it spreading? I guess is probably how I should put it.
Yeah, well, I do actually, and I'm sort of thinking on a 10-year time frame. I think it's gonna become it'll be fairly normative in 10 years. So why do I think that? Well, first of all, as you say, I think the pandemic turned it into a common sense idea. So before the pandemic, there were plenty of people talking about why we should have a 4-day work week before the pandemic. It was just very isolated examples of individual companies doing it. And people thought, oh, that would be great, but it could never happen. Now, it doesn't feel that way to people. It has a common sense dimension to it. And many more people think not only could it happen, but they should have it. And this is part of what we hear from the people in our studies when they tell their clients, for example, that they're going to a 4-day week. Instead of being, what am I going to do on Friday if you're not around? It's like, oh, you go girl. Like people giving me stories of how people are writing back in all caps. That's amazing. I love that you do that, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just a lot more enthusiasm and sense. And it's been interesting how few people want to come out against it, because it's not that comfortable a place in the United States right now to be saying, no, we shouldn't have it. There's a GOP legislator in Maine who recently introduced a 4-day work week bill to Maine. And he said, the people of Maine work hard and they deserve not just to strive, but also to thrive. And the Wharton School, when I first started doing media on this, decided they were going to take up the other side. I think just, to get publicity, or I don't know why, but they started doing podcasts and writing articles and getting a number of their faculty to criticize the 4-day week. And I'm on radio with some of them. And within about a year, they invited me to their annual HR conference. And the most outspoken person said to me, I've come around on this. And then one of the others said, I'm not going to do another thing criticizing what you're doing. And the guy who they had asked to debate me on this refused to take up the other side. I mean, it's just not a comfortable place to be.
That's pretty
so there's one more piece of this, which is, okay, so there's the sort of cultural or just the zeitgeist part of it, but there's also AI. And the fact that we could respond to AI by having mass layoffs in many of particularly a lot of these white collar industries that are the ones that were most likely to be doing this at the moment. And then we've got that huge problem, or we could use it to give people some free time. And it's the CEO of NVIDIA came out last week saying, we're going to get to a 4-day week. Maybe he said a 3. You've got, Bill Gates saying 3.5-day week, and Jamie Dimon. And, a lot of these big business leaders are saying it's coming. AI is going to give us a shorter work week. And so I think that's another really important reason that we've got some tailwind here.
Yeah, no, that's a tremendously important point, on AI, because again, I'm sure you have the same reaction. People are going, oh no, it's going to make everyone unemployed. And we're going, no, people work shorter work weeks. That's a good thing. I mean, obviously that will depend on the institutional structure, but one of the things I had Nick Bloom, is one of the leading experts, maybe the leading expert on remote work from home. And, I was asking him about adoption rates, how people are staying with it after the pandemic. And I mentioned, well, you do have a lot of firms that, telling people back to the office. I just saw, I think it was Microsoft was doing it, and Jeff Bezos at Amazon. Well, he's not at he's not calling, well, maybe he's still calling shots. I don't know. In any case, he's not the CEO. But, what Nick said was, well, all those places you just mentioned are led by 60-year-old men, 60-year-old men. And, there's, in other words, there's a generational issue and obviously a gender issue that, these are not people directly raising kids. If they have kids, they're probably grown and they probably threw the responsibilities on their wives anyhow, and they're not going to be there forever. So if we look out 10 years, maybe it'll still be people in their 60s, but it'll be different people in their 60s, and presumably a lot more of them will be women. So that probably speaks well about the future for 4-day work weeks.
Yeah, well, and I think the other thing about Nick Bloom's work that's pretty striking is all these companies are telling people they have to do this, but the amount of work from home has really plateaued. They just can't get these people back in. I mean, a lot of them leave. So, I mean, there are obviously some companies that have forced people back and people have gone back, but it's that, big push to really get rid of this thing has failed. And I think we got new numbers from his outfit yesterday, I think, or maybe it was earlier today, and we're pretty much holding steady at, I think, that 27% or something like that. I might have that number
Yeah.
wrong, but
No, that's a just mind-blowing figure to me. I mean, you and I have both seen the data, but it's kind of a revolution, revolution of the workplace, but this is where people spend a lot of their lives. And, just, in a very short period of time, it just really hasn't gotten, to my view, the attention it deserves. So.
Yeah, well, one of the interesting things to me about the 4-day week has been the connection to work from home. Now, this is more anecdotal. So I've interviewed CEOs who are doing this, or other people in leadership positions who are doing this at the companies, and a number of them told me they were skeptical about the 4-day week, or they hadn't even thought of it, but they didn't think work from home would work, but it did. And when it did, it made them more open to other changes. And that's why some of them decided, let's try the 4-day week, typically when they were losing people. And they referenced the fact that they'd been skeptical about work from home and it was fine. As one said, and I think I quoted this in my TED Talk, but it's like, work from home taught us that we could trust our people about where they worked, and that made us willing to trust them about about the hours that they work. So there's a real tie there. And again, the pandemic, both the sort of stress levels of the pandemic, which just made everything impossible for people, and that these workplace innovations that the pandemic forced have been key to why we've had so much movement on the 4-day week after so many decades of, just this issue being dead.
Well, let's end it here with some optimism. Not that much for many of us to feel optimistic about these days, but your work on the 4-day work week is certainly, very encouraging, and we'll see. Let's hope it moves forward. So thanks a lot for joining us.
My pleasure. Really great to talk to you as always.
If you like what you just saw, please help us out by liking us and subscribing. Thank you.